Good afternoon. Welcome to our 12th Lunch and Learn presented by the Charlottesville Police Foundation and the Charlottesville Police Department. We're going to wait just a couple more moments just to let people come in, and we'll begin. I think we can start. My name is Gail Milligan. I'm the Executive Director of the Foundation. Now is such an important time for us as members of the community to understand more about policing and the law. And that makes us excited to present this ongoing series and very happy that you're joining us today. We so greatly appreciate the partnership with CPD and the time and effort all the presenters have invested in bringing this information to us. We also appreciate the support from the Batten School of Leadership and Public Policy and from our hosts, Diane and Andrea. The Lunch and Learn series is an outcome of our community engagement and is part of our core mission to inform and connect. In each session, our presenters will offer unique insight to their work and answer questions you have about that work. Before we begin, I want to share a brief overview of our work at CPF. Simply stated, the Charlottesville Police Foundation serves the community by serving the police. We seek to improve the quality of life in Charlottesville by offering a community partner for our police department. The foundation promotes excellence in police services by investing in programs that enhance our department and yet are beyond the reasonable reach of the city's budget. We reward excellence by celebrating the successes of our department and the skills of its officers. And we strengthen the connections between the department and the public through outreach programs and community events like the Lunch and Learn series. Best examples of the support we provide include housing grants to officers, an awards dinner and Officer of the Month program, advanced training for officers, grants for specific needs such as canine, technology, programs in the community, and outreach events like Cops for Kids Day and the Charlottesville Night Out, which celebrates police and community. To clarify, we're an independent 501c3 nonprofit. And while we partner with the Charlottesville Police Department, we don't report to the CPD. To the extent that we advocate for the CPD, it is to improve the quality of policing as a community service. Now I'd like to introduce our presenter. Lieutenant Larry Jones and his family moved to Charlottesville in 2005. He's been an officer with the Charlottesville Police Department since 2006. During that time, he's had multiple assignments within the department that include midnight shift, daylight shift, and investigations. He's a trainer for the department in a variety of topics that include defensive tactics and the crisis intervention team. A quick note, you can add your questions to the Q&A section on the bottom of your screen, but we'll hold your questions until the end of the presentation. Larry, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Gail, and thank you to the foundation for giving us the opportunity to talk about a variety of topics with the community so that they can have a better understanding of our jobs every day. All right, so thank you to everybody who's joined. I'll begin my presentation and hopefully we can get through it quickly enough so that there's plenty of time for questions toward the end. I know that this topic is one that's come up a lot nationally and overall when we talk about policing, and that is use of force. So I've included a lot in it to try to go over, but it is a very broad topic. So forgive me if there's things in there that you may have wanted to see or have questions about, but I didn't address. But it's such a big topic. I had to, pare it down a little bit. But I think I've included a lot that everyone needs to know about. So let's get started. So this is the parameters and analysis of use of force. We'll discuss some different things involved in that. There we go. So we talk about our use of force. I'll just move that a little bit. The Charlottesville Police Department's policy on use of force is referred to as response to resistance. That's just a term that we've chosen to identify use of force within our agency. You may see it still called as use of force at other policing agencies, but that was just a choice that was made by our command staff in terms of how to refer to a broad number of things that come up during use of force. This policy outlines our agency's rules regarding the type of force officers are allowed to use and how and when that force is to be applied. It also outlines what officers are prohibited from doing. So as we get into that, there's three main things that I think we'll need to talk about today to try to give everyone a good general understanding. Some of that is case law, most importantly, our departmental policy, and then we'll talk about officer performance. And I'll try to tie all three of those together to give everyone a good idea of when you see an officer using force, what goes into that and why they do some of the things that they do. The laws and policies regarding use of force by police officers have undergone many changes over the years. This is due to state and federal court cases that offer new guidance based on the circumstances surrounding each of those cases. Another reason for these changes is technology. Over the last 30 years, easily, officers have been given more tools to help resolve incidents that they've been called to respond to, including a variety of less lethal force options that were not available to officers going back into the 80s, the 90s, and I would even say into the early 2000s. And that technology has certainly helped improve the outcomes of a number of situations that could have been very different. So as we talk about those case laws that help set the parameters for an officer's actions, one of the most important ones is Graham versus Connor. It's a very particular case in which the Supreme Court looked at a use of force by a police department and outlined some very critical rules and thoughts that need to be taken into consideration. And since that case, officers and police agencies across the country are regularly taught this case, and also it serves as the backbone of a lot of police agency policies, and including court cases where an officer may be called into scrutiny relating to their actions, whether they tase someone or use a baton or use deadly force. The Graham versus Connor case is brought up regularly in those court cases to establish what precedent there was for the officer to take those actions. So during Graham versus Connor, I have a quick outline of it. The petitioner, Mr. Graham, was a diabetic. He had asked his friend Barry to drive him to a convenience store to purchase orange juice to counteract an onset of an insulin reaction. Upon entering the store and seeing a number of people ahead of him, Graham hurried out and asked Barry to drive him to a friend's house instead. The respondent, who in this case, Officer Connor, and because he was charged with this, you could also refer to him as the defendant for the trial. Officer Connor was a Charlotte, North Carolina officer. He became suspicious in seeing Graham hastily enter the store and then leave, followed by Barry's car, and made an investigative stop in order to try to find out what was going on inside the store. Basically, Connor's belief was, seeing Graham rush into the store quickly and then rush back out shortly thereafter, looked at him like the hallmarks of perhaps somebody who had robbed the store. And based on an earlier case, Terry versus Ohio, he basically conducted an investigative stop, or what sometimes people will call a Terry stop, under the belief that he had witnessed or suspected that a crime might have just occurred. So upon stopping the car, Officer Connor talks to the two people, then goes back to his patrol car, calls for backup. Graham, still suffering from an insulin reaction, gets out of the car, runs around it twice, and finally sat down on the curb where he briefly passes out. Additional officers arrive and handcuff Graham, believing him to be drunk. During the course of the stop, Graham suffered some injuries related to those officers handcuffing him and moving him around quite a bit. Graham was released once Officer Connor has another officer go back to the store and confirm that nothing happened. So he's released and the police drive him home. Graham filed a lawsuit under a 1983 statute against the respondents, alleging an excessive force and making the stop in a violation of his rights secured under the 14th Amendment. So in that, and I'll just tell you, Graham did not win the case for some of these reasons that were outlined, but also because the court recognized that Graham's claim under the 14th Amendment was incorrect. It was actually a Fourth Amendment violation, so his claim was found to be invalid. Any use of force by law enforcement needs to take into account a number of different factors, and these are the parameters that the court set out, and that's why this case is so important today, as they identified these things. The severity of the crime at issue, so is this a misdemeanor, is this a felony, is it for a bad check, or is it because this person is been involved in a violent domestic, are they a bank robber? So the severity of the crime is very important to the type of force that's used against them. Whether the suspect poses an immediate threat to the safety of the officers or others, I think that's kind of self-explanatory. Obviously, if the person is very threatening or harmful to the officer, but also if he's very threatening or harmful to someone on the scene that the officer is present at. So again, I think back to a domestic or some sort of a fight between two parties and the other person goes to attack a victim, it's important then to know that, and that can definitely inform an officer's response in terms of the force that they use. Whether he is actively resisting arrest or attempting to evade arrest by flight. Again, so if they're fighting with the officer, striking them, throwing things at them to avoid being arrested, that's something we would definitely call active resistance. He's not just standing there with his hands down by his side or refusing to leave. And is he evading arrest by flight? That could be on foot or in a vehicle. Obviously, in a vehicle can be a little more dangerous, certainly for all parties involved. But these are things that they said had to be taken into consideration. Graham served as the basis for a lot of cases, but it was not the end-all be-all related to review of use of force. And so other courts have also tacked on additional factors that they say should be taken into consideration when looking at a use of force case, such as the size and skill level and the number of offenders involved to kind of determine whether the officer's use of force is reasonable. As most would imagine, you know, if you have an officer who's 5'7" and the offender is 6'5" and, you know, he weighs 280 pounds and the officer weighs 170, there's a huge size difference there. And it could be very difficult for an officer of that stature to arrest a person who's much larger and much heavier. So the court is saying that obviously, you know, using a little more force on that person is reasonable and should be taken into account. Additionally, you talk about skill level. There are a lot of people who are former, you know, college wrestlers. There's a lot of MMA and UFC gyms these days where people train and develop different skill levels. You know, years ago, it mostly used to be boxing gyms, and there are a lot of those in the YMCAs and things like that. So skill level became an important thing to take into consideration when looking at whether or not an officer's force was reasonable. And then obviously, if there's two or more offenders, you know, both aggressing upon an officer is something that should be taken into consideration as well. That's not the exclusive list of factors, but those are a short snippet of some of the things that they look at. So looking at the court's reasoning about this, one of the bigger things that came out, and this is included in a lot of agency policies, the language that talks about objective reasonableness. That's spoken of quite a bit. And it's because in this case, the judges said that that's a huge thing that has to be taken into consideration when you look at whether or not a use of force was a good one. And it says that the reasonableness of a particular use of force must be judged from the perspective of a reasonable officer on the scene rather than with 20/20 vision of hindsight. And what they were trying to say is that, you know, they have to look at the situation that occurred with the lens of a reasonable officer who, in that same situation, knowing what they know and not after it's all occurred, and we can gather more facts and know more things about all the circumstances surrounding it, because obviously then you can clarify a lot of your thoughts and actions much better if you can think about them in hindsight as opposed to what you're faced with in the moment. And so the court was just trying to set forward some sort of standard to say, this is how we need to look at these things. It's not fair to quote unquote Monday morning quarterback these things. You can only act on what you know at the time, much like what the officer thought when Graham entered the store and rushed back out at the time was, you know, those have the hallmarks of someone who's probably just robbed the store. He ran in, he ran back out, jumped in a car, and they took off very quickly. It gave the officer a lot of suspicion that a crime had occurred. And so you have to kind of think about those things in the moment, not so much in hindsight. A couple of other benchmark cases, and we won't get into these, but I just wanted to make sure that we touch on them very quickly, is Tennessee versus Garner, which addresses use of force against a fleeing felon, where an officer shot a fleeing felon. And this was many years ago. Again, officers didn't have nearly as many tools to bring the situation under control. But again, it set forward a standard about the type of force that you can and cannot use. And the court now said that shooting a person who's fleeing after they've committed a felonious crime is not okay. The fact that they committed a felony in and of itself is not a reason to use force to that level, and that it needs to be thought out a little bit more carefully. Terry Bush's Ohio goes into search and seizure, basically when you can stop a person based on a suspicion of a crime. And it's based on the totality of circumstances that an officer is using to make that stop. But it gives them some latitude to make those detentions, even frisk people or do a pat down, but not necessarily search their pockets and their bag, but maybe pat things down to make sure that they're not armed with a weapon. And then Armstrong v. Pinehurst is a newer case that regards less lethal uses of force. And that case involved the use of a taser. And that was from our Fourth Circuit here, the U.S. Fourth Circuit Court, which Virginia falls within. And it's an important case just because it really does set a new set of parameters for taser usage when before it was a little more lax and I would say less regulated. But the Fourth Circuit looked at that case and said there needed to be some changes to address the type of force that a taser inflicts on a person. So as we get to my department, the Charlottesville Police Department's response to resistance options include this list. Again, this is not necessarily an exhaustive list of our force options, but this does capture a good bit of what we have on hand, especially an officer who's working from day to day. So one of the first things that starts our use of force is officer presence. Just the mere fact that we're there can be seen sometimes as a use of force. Communication, giving lawful commands, non-escalation and de-escalation techniques as you talk to people is another one of those factors. Physical controls, so that's now putting your hands on the person to try to effect an arrest or a detention. That's often referred to as defensive tactics or takedowns. OC spray, I think most people are familiar with it. Everybody more or less calls it pepper spray, but it's OC spray, oleresin capsicum. So it's an irritant, and most people would spray it in the eyes, and kind of people will relent under that burning sensation to the eyes and face. A CEW is a conducted electrical weapon, but more people probably know it as a taser. But that's the device most people have seen, officers carry on their belt, and it fires a couple of probes out that deliver an electrical charge to a person to try to help incapacitate them and make it easier for them to be handcuffed. A baton, officers tend to carry a collapsible baton on their belt, but officers do also still have access to longer batons that are not collapsible, but those are usually left in the car because they're more unwieldy to carry around from day to day. But the ASP baton is what our department carries, and it's about a 20-inch collapsible baton that an officer has on their belt, generally speaking. There are also access to kinetic weapons. These are typically bean bags or foam batons that are fired from a less lethal shotgun. Our department marks these out in orange. So you may see an officer out with a shotgun, but if you see that orange stock or handguard on it, you'll know that it's a less lethal shotgun and not an actual shotgun loaded with real ammunition. Those beanbag rounds, those foam batons can be very effective in helping deal with a situation where you don't want to shoot a person because they're in possession of a deadly weapon themselves, but you're looking to try to see if you can get them to relent, to drop the knife or a bat or any other type of implement they might have. The K9 unit, we have several dogs, and then they can be used and deployed in a variety of situations, but whether they're just out of the car or actually used to deploy on someone can be taken into consideration in our use of force. And then, of course, there are firearms. So officers have access to a few different firearms during their day-to-day, their sidearm that they carry on them, or a shotgun or a rifle that's usually kept in the field. So moving into our policy a little deeper, we have what's called the response to resistance decision-making chart, and that reflects what the officer's escalation of force options are when presented with certain behaviors while conducting police business. It is the subject's behavior that places the officer and others in danger. The subject's threat is the primary factor in choosing a force option. However, the officer should also consider the totality of circumstances, but not limited to the altered state due to drugs, alcohol, any mental impairments, medical condition, or proximity to any weapons. So this is our chart, and as you can see, it's shaped out like a pyramid. It talks about escalation and de-escalation. So starting at the bottom of the chart, you can see these are what's called no force. So going back to what I was talking about earlier, initial show up of an officer, your presence, your communication, and your non-escalation and de-escalation techniques as you talk to someone. And these are reserved for compliant to non-aggressive individuals. As we move a little higher, we get to what's called moderate force. Again, working to de-escalate the situation, followed by physical control. So going back to the defensive tactics, takedowns, and then OC spray. And these can be used when dealing with non-compliant and resisting subjects. Moving a little further up, you get to less lethal force. So now we're trying to de-escalate the situation. We're going to try to use some of these other ones. This should be CEW, not ECW. Baton, kinetic, and K9. And these will be used when the subject is physically aggressive, assaultive, and there's a likelihood of injury. And our last level is deadly force. And again, starting with de-escalation, the use of a firearm is typically going to be what that deadly force is going to be. And then that's employed because there's a reasonable belief of imminent threat of death or serious bodily injury to the officer or someone else. What's important to note about this pyramid, and I need to make it very clear, departments have tried for years to encapsulate all these options that officers are continually getting in some sort of a chart, a flow chart, a diagram, just anything to make it visually accessible. So it's gone from a ladder to what they call a step system to a wheel to some departments now are using this pyramid. But what's important to know about that is that an officer can go from this green no force area to the red deadly force area almost immediately, depending on the circumstance. There is no requirement that an officer has to move through each one of these steps very methodically before they get to the next one, just because the nature of an incident can be quickly evolving that might require an officer to go straight to the top. What's very important, though, is that upon realizing that there may not be a need for deadly force, an officer needs to know that he can de-escalate just as quickly as the situation escalates. So let's talk about those options just a little bit, and these are all captured from our department policy. No force speaks to the level of force when an officer can interact with a subject, and mere presence and verbal communication are enough to gain compliance. So an officer walks up, begins engaging with the person, and just through being there and talking to them, they're able to get them to comply with their commands to leave or stop or do whatever needs to be done as they investigate the situation. Moving from there into moderate to limited force, the level of control necessary to interact with the subject who is displaying active resistance and is non-responsive to de-escalation efforts. This level of force has a low probability of causing injury and includes physical controls, such as control holds and other weaponless techniques. So just moving a little further into, the officer showed up, you try to talk to the person, they're not being responsive, and they're starting to display, or they are displaying active resistance in some manner. And that could be refusing to put their hands behind their back or to sit someplace to be away from perhaps the other party or victim related to the incident, and they feel like they need to detain them, or they need to be arrested, and the person just has decided that they don't feel like they should be arrested and don't want to comply. Moving from there, you get into less lethal force. When de-escalation techniques are not effective or appropriate, an officer may consider the use of less lethal force to control a non-compliant or actively resistant individual, but this level of force poses a foreseeable risk of significant injury or harm, but is less likely to cause death. So this is where we move to start using some of those other tools, things like the taser, those kinetic weapons, maybe even a canine, depending on what the circumstances are. The idea being trying to resolve this situation, again, in the safest manner possible without having to use deadly force. But now the situation is escalated to a point that we're moving in that direction, and we're trying to figure out a way to bring it to a close and de-escalate it through some other means. So using those beanbag rounds sometimes can be very effective in striking a subject and changing their mind about, how resistant they're going to be, or to put down a weapon that they're waving around, and things of that nature. And then we move into deadly force. Any use of force substantially likely to cause serious bodily injury or death, including but not limited to the discharge of a firearm, the use of an impact weapon under some circumstances, other techniques or equipment, weapons of last resort, and certain interventions to stop a subject's vehicle. Most people would expect that deadly force would be the use of a firearm, and they would be correct that it includes that, but it is not limited to that. If an officer does not have access to their firearm, this is turned into a fight of the sort where taking his gun out of the holster might put him in more jeopardy. It's possible that they would use an impact weapon under those circumstances, which might be their ASP. And so striking someone in a vulnerable area that's not allowed under normal circumstances for when you hit someone with your baton is now allowed because it's deadly force. And that would probably be, if we were to speak about specific areas, a blow to the head or a blow directly to the chest or sternum area or some other sensitive area like the groin. Things like those are not allowed under normal circumstances, but if it's a deadly force situation, they do become an option. Other techniques or equipment, just as kind of a catch-all for the possibility that you may deploy a weapon system in a non-traditional format that would then constitute deadly force because of the likelihood for harm. And weapons of last resort just kind of covers, if an officer had to, say for instance, pick up a rock and hit someone because that was the only thing they could use, that would be considered something like a weapon of last resort. Or if an officer had a pocket knife, things like that, that's a weapon of last resort. Additionally, and we'll cover this a little bit, but sometimes even hand-to-hand fighting techniques can be considered weapons of last resort. So prohibited acts. Officers, by our policy, are not allowed to hog tie suspects. And that basically means to handcuff and bind someone's feet together. So we do have shackles for people's legs to keep them from being able to kick, or if they're a prisoner being transported to easily run away. And then of course we have handcuffs. And so it's okay to sometimes chain those folks together in the front, but it is not okay to hog tie them, which refers to if you were to handcuff their hands behind their back and then also shackle their feet and then run a chain or some type of rope between the two to pull their hands and feet closer together, which would also put them face down on the ground in a prone position, which is not a safe position to put people in, especially when you've bound them like that. So you're not allowed to hog tie. Firing of warning shots is not allowed. Once upon a time, agencies used to do things like that, but there's an inherent danger in what it would mean to fire a warning shot. That bullet has to go somewhere at some point in time. So there's the threat to the public in what firing a warning shot might do. The use of chokeholds or neck restraints are prohibited acts, except in circumstances where deadly force is appropriate. So once again, under normal circumstances is an absolute no, but if an officer is in a fight with an individual or trying to protect the safety of another individual, like the victim or even another officer, that does become an option because it's now raised the force level to deadly force. Shooting in a moving vehicle, again, same thing, except in circumstances that deadly force is appropriate. Shooting in a vehicle is not allowed for a lot of reasons. Most importantly, knowing that if you do incapacitate the driver of the vehicle, that vehicle, especially if moving at speed, it is now out of control and can do a lot of damage or harm to other individuals. So it's very much frowned upon to shoot at a moving vehicle, and there would have to be some very mitigating circumstances to do that. And to restrict the airway of a subject who is face down with their knee, arm, or leg. And that one obviously has come up in recent years with a lot of different things that has been seen in policing. And that type of technique was never taught to any police officer. I instruct at the academy in defensive tactics, and we talk about how to address subduing individuals and putting them on the ground. And at no point is it ever taught or suggested to put your knee, your arm, or your leg across an individual's neck or airway to affect some type of submission to get them to comply, just because of the inherent danger that doing such a thing poses. So upon any responsive resistance, our department has a long list of requirements, but I've again pared that down for the sake of time. Our reporting requirements is that each officer shall complete a subject resistance report to document all response to resistance incidents. In the event of an injury to either the subject or an officer, the officer's use of an impact weapon, police canine, CEW, or OC, the immediate supervisor will receive a notification and respond to the scene to ensure the safety and well-being of the officer and the subjects involved. So that subject resistance report is not required in the following situations. It quickly outlines the mere presence of the officer or a police canine does not constitute a use of force. And officers' issuance of verbal commands is not a use of force that needs to be documented. Compliant handcuffing, if they walk up to them and they say, hey, put your hands behind your back, they do, they put the cuffs on, that is not a use of force. Escort holds, that refers to a defensive tactic technique, basically where you can take someone by the arm and move them or take them away from whatever it is that's going on in a controlled manner, but with no resistance, does not require a use of force. The physical removal of otherwise passively resisting demonstrator, again, that's just if we had to pick someone up and move them out of a roadway or place, as long as we're not using any harmful force, the act of merely moving them is not considered a use of force for our reporting standards. And the unholstering or display of a firearm or other weapon, such as a taser, such as a baton, or even OC spray, these occurrences are documented in a different way under a form we call weapons compliance. So one of the last areas I'll cover pretty quickly here is officer performance. And officer performance can be affected by a variety of factors. And I know that that's definitely one of the things that gets called into question a lot when people see police videos and court cases and things like that. And they are an important thing to definitely talk about and take into consideration. But there are a lot of different factors that go into why an officer performed or did what they did. Their training, experience level, personal experiences, are innate physiological responses. The fitness of that person and their age can be all things that play a role. Obviously, someone with a high level of training or a high level of experience, maybe even who's had a number of different experiences in their time as a police officer, either personal or on the job, could impact some things. Your innate physiological response basically just refers to, as a person, people have physiological responses related to your cognitive and nervous systems, and they play a huge role in your decision-making processes. Obviously, an officer's fitness plays a role in a lot of what they do, as they may get a little more winded or tired, and may not be able to stay in a fight as long as maybe some other officer who's in a lot better shape, can affect their performance. Maybe it's been a long foot pursuit, things of that nature. So fitness can play a real role in the officer's performance as well. And then age is always a factor. I would say most people would understand that, a 25-year-old officer can probably do a number of things that a, 40 to 50-year-old officer may not be able to do anymore after perhaps serving in this job for 20 years or so. So when we look at training, training plays a big role in the way an officer will perform in a given situation. I think it goes without saying that, if we were to use the sports analogies, teams train all the time, and they have lots of camps, and those things play a big role in how an athlete would perform. And it's the same is true in the policing profession. That training plays a big role in how an officer is going to perform in a given situation when they're called to respond to it. Officers receive most of their training at the police academy, with additional training obtained throughout their career. So they go through a huge amount of training initially going through the academy. And then once they're graduated, they'll come to their agency and they'll receive a lot more training once they first get there. And then throughout that time, as they continue being officers, there's a lot of different trainings that they'll be sent to try to address different needs, but also to reinforce new principles, new techniques, and again, as I spoke about earlier, new technologies that's being brought to bear that officer now has access to. Officers also receive refresher training through their department, generally on an annual basis. And those cover some of the core disciplines, a lot of times related to things like defensive tactics, firearms, ASP, a lot of the force options, because obviously they're important. So officers need to make sure that they know how and when they can employ those things. And it also includes other things like bias-based policing and other trainings to help deal with crisis intervention and things like that. So we get to experience level and personal experiences. Prior experiences serve to inform an officer's decision-making processes. This can be good or bad. Officers can develop on an ability to manage tense situations or to be empathetic to a person in a crisis. And that's definitely a good thing. That's what I think most people would like to see as an officer goes through their career and picking up on different things as they go from call to call. However, it can have poor outcomes that have similar impacts on an officer's development and abilities, including developing PTSD or becoming what's sometimes called hypervigilance. And this could be the result of having gotten into an altercation or some sort of other fight or incident where, as a result of that, they've developed some nervousness about what it means to go to a call like that again. I think most people kind of understand PTSD in general, and it is not uncommon for officers to suffer from that, especially when you've had an instance where you've literally been in fear for your life or your safety because of something that happened. On the tail end, they can also become hypervigilant, which just means from there on out, when faced with similar circumstances, they're very quick to react. Not always in a bad way, I would say per se, but just they're very quick to then want to tell people what to do. Keep your hands here, turn around, face away. They'll be a little more stern with people, and that oftentimes is born out of the fact that they may have been sucker punched by an individual before and felt again that they were threatened, and now from there on out they start to take that action a little bit more immediately. Previous experience with certain types of calls can give officers a breadth of knowledge to pull from to help resolve those types of situations. And I would say more often than not, that is what happens to officers who stay in this profession for a while. You continue to build on those personal experiences, and you, of course, build on your experience level, and you then use those in a very positive way to resolve the situations that you're faced with. And I think we do that every day on a regular basis pretty well. Physiological responses is something that just cannot be ignored. Officers are normal people. They experience the same type of basic responses to a given stimulus as anyone else. Three of the most commonly known phases of this are fight, flight, or freeze. Police officers, just like anyone else, when faced with a very stressful situation or some type of stimulus which provokes the thought that they or someone else might get hurt, will tend to fall into one of these three categories. More often than not, they'll go into the first one, which is fight. You know, they'll go to grab that person, pull them away, try to get them into handcuffs. Occasionally they'll go into flight, which may not mean headlong running away from the situation, but kind of a delayed response. They may want to, back away from the situation a lot more. I don't mean like creating time and distance as an advantage, but more or less just backing away because they don't really want to engage. And then there's freeze, where officers will just not quite be frozen in stone, but be very slow in their decision-making process because they're kind of locked in. And it's a basic physiological response to the stimulus that they're facing. And it's important to know that our training helps with that, but that's not the end all be all when it comes to these things. So these things can be offset with good, regular occurring trainings that fully encapsulate the types of incidents that officers might respond to. Sometimes we call that force-on-force training or scenario-based training, things like that, where we really do live action drills to force them to deal with that stimulus I'm talking about, so that if they do freeze, if they do fall into flight, or if they go into fight mode before it's time to do that, we can address those through training and try to get them to where they need to be. However, no training can ever fully mitigate your basic human physiological response system. We're hardwired through our evolution to respond in a lot of different ways. And those show themselves under a variety of different conditions. For this person, that's not a trigger, but for that person it is. And for the third person, it's a totally different set of processes they go through. And this is very true when under extreme stress or fear of personal harm to themselves or others. And lastly, I'll just close with officers face a tremendous amount of pressure to make the right decisions while doing their duties. When faced with non-compliant, passive-aggressive, or actively aggressive subjects, they must choose the right tactics and tools to resolve the situation as safely as possible. And even when done right, oftentimes no use of force looks good to a passive observer of the situation. It's always important to know all the facts and circumstances and weigh them as the officer would in the moment and not in hindsight. Most people don't turn around to see the officer encounter until they hear what's going on, and by that time they may have missed a lot that's occurred. But I would also say I'm not a proponent of shying away from the fact that officers do make missteps, and if that is the case, then those things need to be identified and they need to be addressed, and disciplinary action needs to be taken up to and including firing. And if an officer does something overly egregious, up to and including prosecution. The way around that as a good police agency is to have good policies and procedures and to stick to them, and also to have great training opportunities and ways to teach the officers how to perform their duties the way that we want them to, so that they don't have to guess at it when the moment calls for it. All right, and that is the end of my presentation. I thank you all for your time and consideration. I hope this has been informative and helpful. I know this is very quick. There's so much more we could go into, and I'm glad to work with the foundation to do anything more to help people understand this topic, since I know it's such a hot topic and something that the public is always concerned about.
Larry, thank you very much. That was very comprehensive and really, really interesting and very well presented. So thank you. Just a couple of questions. To your knowledge, have there ever been challenges to the Graham Supreme Court case?
I don't know that there's been any direct challenges in terms of the way it's being discussed, like Roe v. Wade, with it being overturned. More so, it's been talked about that maybe that's not the standard that police departments should stick to. Maybe that there's more that needs to be done or added to it. Any agency could try to write their policy more strictly than Graham, but Graham sets the standard for what the federal Supreme Court looks at when a case goes before them. It's been brought up a lot. I don't know that there's any direct challenges to, is my answer. I think what's been spoken of, even by police agency, is that maybe that's not the end-all be-all standard that we should apply in policing. And maybe there's another practice that should be brought to bear to address current times and things like that.
Okay, great, thanks. So another question, do you have with you by any chance your data on the experience of Charlottesville Police Department use of force incidents? Obviously, all of you have to be very well trained and revisit use of force policy constantly. But I'm under the impression there's not that many instances of use of force for calls for CPD.
Okay, so I guess you're asking is how many uses of force have we had?
Right.
Okay. Yes, I do know that number. Give me just 1 second.
Of course you know that number.
I figured it would be a question. So in 2019, we had 109 incidents. In 2020, we had 83, but that number is actually lower because during that time, as we were revamping our policy and trying to create new forms to capture data, one of the things that was created was the weapons compliance form, which just means if an officer took out a weapon system but didn't use it. So those numbers include weapons compliance. The following year, or this year rather, we're up to 83 for 2021 under our new policy standards, where forcible handcuffing and things like that count as a category for a use of force. So the numbers are about the same, as you can see, throughout all 3 years. So I would say we're probably on track to close 2021 at the same numbers as 2019, perhaps. But none of those within the last 3 years has been what I would say, I think everyone would know, a deadly use of force situation for our department. We have not shot or severely injured someone to that degree.
Great. Thank you. I am just looking for any more questions, and I'm not seeing any more. So we will end. And we so greatly appreciate you walking us through this really complex and controversial topic and making it so understandable. The next Lunch and Learn will be held on Wednesday, December 15th, and our presenter will be Dr. Brian Williams. That title is At the Intersection of Past and Present: Where Does Relational Policing in Charlottesville Go From Here? In the meantime, enjoy your Thanksgiving holiday, and thanks for coming.
Thank you.